You guys ever think about dying? Because I do. And I've been thinking more and more about it ever since I watched Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan's latest film. And I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to talk about Oppenheimer. I'm going to talk about Prometheus, because Prometheus is a big part of that movie, and Bloodborne. We're stomping around Central Yarnum. All these things are sort of related in my mind. They have a lot to do with each other. So we're going to start off by just talking about the myth of Prometheus, what that actually is, and how it relates to these two things. Because Oppenheimer actually starts off with a quote. It says, Prometheus stole fire from the gods. For this he was chained to a rock and tortured for all eternity. Which is like the hardest way to open a movie, to have this text over like a nuclear explosion that's happening in the background. It's wild. But this movie Oppenheimer was actually adapted from a book called The Modern Prometheus. I think. Let me actually look that up and see who it was that wrote that. Or maybe it was American Prometheus. This is great content, by the way. Just clicking and clacking and me Googling things. Yeah, so it's called American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin, two historians. Sherwin, I believe, went on to write another book about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So sort of what happened after, the invention of nuclear weapons and all of that went down. But it's very clear from the beginning of this book, or from this movie, that Christopher Nolan and Sherwin, by extension, are trying to draw a direct line between the myth of Prometheus and the historical figure of Oppenheimer. So who was Prometheus, right? How did we get this comparison here? Well, Prometheus is a character in a number of different Greek myths, a number of tragic plays. He's a character who has been sort of iterated on time and time again by different authors and writers and philosophers. But the core story of Prometheus is that he was a Titan. He was not an Olympian like Zeus and like the pantheon of gods that people are most familiar with when it comes to Greek mythology. He was a Titan. He was one of these figures that sort of came before the Olympians, but he, in some tellings, sided with the Olympians in their war against the Titans. All of Greek mythology sort of has this background to it, that the people who are in charge now, especially Zeus, were this insurgent force that overthrew the old ruling class of the Titans, and assumed that power for themselves. So Prometheus was almost like a traitor to his kind. He was a Titan, but he sides with the Olympians. But later on, he betrays Zeus and sides with humanity. And there's a bunch of different stories about how this happens. One of them that's really interesting is that he tricks Zeus. They're trying to figure out what humans are going to sacrifice to the gods in order to maintain this, equanimous and healthy relationship between humanity and gods, because that was very important, keeping this healthy relationship between these two categories of existence. And Prometheus told the humans to wrap a bunch of animal fat around these bones and then offer it to the gods. So it's something that looks pleasing on the outside, but it's kind of worthless on the inside. It's just a bunch of bones. That's one of the stories of Prometheus betraying Zeus. There's a bunch of different ones. But the one that people are probably most familiar with would be when he stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. And as time went on, as this story was iterated on more and more by different authors, fire came to symbolize a whole lot of different things. It wasn't just fire, right? Anybody can make fire. It's not that hard. We use fire all the time, every day in our lives. But it came to symbolize things like technology, the creative power of the gods. Hephaestus is the blacksmith of the gods. Fire, giving fire to humanity was almost like Prometheus taking away this creative power from the gods and giving it to humans. And it came to stand in for even like civilization itself, right? This civilizing force, the power to create a civilization, was given to humanity by Prometheus. And this was something that was supposed to just belong to the gods. He was punished for this. Right? He was chained to a rock in some versions of the myth. He just has to sit there and be chained to the rock until Zeus changes his mind. Maybe Zeus will, maybe he won't. Could be for all eternity. Other myths say that this bird sent by Zeus, because birds and eagles were associated with Zeus, this bird would come and eat Prometheus's liver, and then overnight his liver would grow back, and then the bird would come back and eat it again. And so this sort of endless torment, never-ending cycle of getting his liver eaten. This has really stuck around as far as like a story and a theme that people have been interested in talking about and applying to their own circumstances, their own lives, their own cultural contexts. One of the reasons why I bring up Bloodborne and why we're watching this on the screen, we're watching me just get absolutely destroyed by these guys. Look at that pro gamer moment. Mary Shelley is kind of like the godmother of science fiction and horror, because she wrote Frankenstein. I think it's, I think it's correct to say we wouldn't have something like Bloodborne if Mary Shelley had never written Frankenstein. It all starts with this book, and the subtitle of Frankenstein is The Modern Prometheus. So even back in the 1800s, I think it was the 19th century when she wrote Frankenstein, she was thinking about this story as well that was thousands and thousands of years old. It has come to be known as kind of like a shorthand for hubris, right? If you're calling somebody a Prometheus or saying that they are sort of like Prometheus in some way, it's a person who doesn't really understand the consequences of their actions. There's a little bit of irony going on behind the scenes here with this name. Prometheus there's ways to interpret that word in Greek that mean foresight. And that's ironic because Prometheus did not have foresight. He could not see the consequences of his actions. So yeah, kind of a shorthand for humanity reaching farther than it ought to, reaching for things that shouldn't belong to them, or maybe acquiring power or technology that has these unforeseen consequences. And it's kind of invoked in modern times as a stand-in for technological progress that brings about this unseen danger. People have these wild ambitions, and this ambitious part of their character serves as sort of an ironic or dramatic or tragic aspect of their character. Somebody who's a stand-in for Prometheus in a story is not a bad person. They are a very talented and skilled person. They are a person who's maybe a little self-obsessed, but they are somebody who has the power to really reach for something that other people don't. And that power and ambition and skill sort of blinds them. It makes them unable to take a look into the future and think about the possible consequences of their actions. Very similar to Icarus, right? Flying too close to the sun, getting too high up there. There are consequences for your actions that you might not even understand, and by the time you've committed to those actions, it's too late to reverse what's coming for you. This is a classic way to tell a story. This is a classic character archetype, and it all comes from these Greek myths thousands and thousands of years ago. And I think one of the reasons, kind of skipping ahead a little bit here, one of the reasons that Fromsoftware's worlds and their stories and characters resonate with so many people is because they play around with these old archetypes, these classic literary themes of ambition and consequences of somebody reaching too far, reaching into the unknown, and pulling back something that they should never have tried to grasp in the first place. That's what Bloodborne is all about. And the last important thing about this myth is that fire permanently changes humanity. It reorganizes us and shapes our culture. So whatever this Prometheus character in your story is bringing back from the gods, is stealing from the gods, it's not just a useful type of technology. It's not just something that's helpful in the long run. It's something that in some way fundamentally changes what it means to be a human being. And that's where we get into Oppenheimer and why so many people have compared the historical figure of Oppenheimer to somebody like Prometheus. And again, this movie opens with just a hard-ass quote about Prometheus being chained to a rock and tortured for all eternity. They're not subtle at all about the fact that they want you to be thinking about Prometheus while you are watching the film. And just as a side note, go see this movie. Go see Oppenheimer. It is phenomenal. It is even better than I thought it would be. I like Christopher Nolan's movies. I know that his stuff can be a little cheesy sometimes. It can be not subtle at all. He makes big, fun blockbusters, and I appreciate that. But this movie really stuck with me in a way that none of his other movies have. I think it's a seriously good movie and one that people are going to be thinking about and writing about and talking about for quite a while. So I would encourage you to go see it. If you have an IMAX theater near you, go check it out, because yeah, it's seriously good. There is a scene in this movie, and spoilers, by the way, spoilers for all of this, for Bloodborne, for Oppenheimer. We're going to be talking about kind of the whole scope of these stories here. There's a scene around the middle of the movie where Oppenheimer is talking with some of these other scientists who are on the Manhattan Project. They're trying to develop an atomic weapon before Nazi Germany is able to. And Nazi Germany at this time, in 1942, 1943, was years ahead of America and the Allied forces, or at least that's what people believed at the time. So it really was kind of a race against the clock. We're trying to throw as much money and as many talented minds as we can at this problem to try and beat the Nazis to the bomb. And things are going well in the Manhattan Project. They're making a lot of progress. Then there's this scene kind of in the middle of the movie where one of the scientists talks to Oppenheimer about the possibility of something called atmospheric ignition. A nuclear weapon, an atomic bomb, works by chain reaction, right? I'm not a scientist. My background is not in science, but the very basics of it is this is about chain reactions, right? Well, one of the scientists comes to Oppenheimer and says, hey, there's a small chance that if we test this bomb, if we set it off for the very first time, the chain reaction is not going to stop. It'll just keep going, and it will ignite the atmosphere of the Earth and wipe out all life and turn the Earth just into this like burning husk. And they're understandably pretty concerned about this. And so they run some more tests, and the scientist comes back and he says, okay, we figured out that it's basically impossible that our bomb would ignite the atmosphere. There's basically a 0% chance. which is different from a 0% chance. Somebody saying, yeah, it's probably not going to happen, it's almost certainly not going to happen, is not the same thing as 0%, especially when you're talking about ending all life on Earth. And that scene really it really serves to illustrate what sort of power we're talking about when we talk about an atomic weapon, and how this is a type of power that no human being has ever had before. The power to completely, potentially destroy all life on Earth. And humanity's been around for, 200,000 years? The first anatomically modern humans showed up around that time. Our historical records go back, at least when things are super clear, only about 10,000 years. And so for all this time, until the day of the Trinity test in 1945, nobody ever had that power. But now we live in a world where some people do. Now we live in a world with lots and lots of nuclear weapons. And at any time, somebody could press that button and set off that chain reaction. And this wouldn't be something like atmospheric ignition. It would be something like mutually assured destruction. So, there's something to think about, right? This power that Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project brought into the world has, in a sense, fundamentally changed who we are as people and the kind of worlds that we live in now. Because, now we live in the post-nuclear weapon world. Now we are living in a world where people have this sort of power. The movie also pays a lot of attention to this idea that theory always leads to action. There's no such thing as pure theory, at least when it comes to weapons development and the science that supports the development of weapons. You can't just, sit around in a room doing your equations and at the end of the day say, my hands are clean, right? I didn't build the bomb. Theory always leads to action, and these actions always lead to consequences. And humanity has this we have this self-destructive side to ourselves. And you can see that clearly in all sorts of different stories and traditions. And I mean, if you've just lived a life and been around, you know that people have this self-destructive bent in them sometimes. So no one has ever had this power before. And now at the end of the film, Oppenheimer hands this power over to a lot of very petty bureaucrats and war hawks, people who don't understand the kind of power that they have, people who are willing to use it if they think it will help them further their goals. The latter, third of the film, because this is a long movie, probably the last third of the film is just all about people grilling Oppenheimer through this framing of revoking his security clearance, grilling him for his life, his former communist associations, basically because afterwards, after he helped develop this bomb, he started to have some mixed feelings about it. I think that's probably a fair way to put it. And there's a lot of debate about, whether he was remorseful afterwards or whether this was like a PR move and he was trying to just appear as like, the adult in the room, trying to bring people to the table and make arms agreements. But it's very clear that his position was the outlier position afterwards. He was much more hesitant about the development and use of these weapons than his peers. And that's sort of the ironic or tragic aspect of his character here, is that he lacked that foresight. At least that's the perspective that the movie brings, I think, is it's painting Oppenheimer as a character who was sort of drunk on this power of running the Manhattan Project, bringing his theories to life, of being the most prominent scientist in the world. But he could not see that all of those benefits that he was accruing because of his position and his knowledge and his learning were also bringing about these unintended consequences. He was ignorant about what the bomb would be used for. Maybe willingly ignorant, maybe unwillingly ignorant. It's hard to tell. He was kind of an ambiguous figure in history, and I don't know a whole lot about him, but it definitely seems like, yeah, he fits the bill, right? If we're looking for an American Prometheus, this is the guy, right? This is the guy who brought this new power to humanity and fundamentally changed the world where we live in. Oppenheimer is tortured for this in his real life, in the movie, but his torture was psychological rather than divine. It was internal rather than external and physical. And now our world has been reorganized because of this power that was brought to life by the Manhattan Project, by Oppenheimer. War is very different now. War is very different than it used to be because of these concepts of mutually assured destruction, because of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So, yeah, that is, I think, a very appropriate subtitle for this film and for the historical figure of Oppenheimer. So now we move to Bloodborne, this video game that we all know and love. And this is also very related to the myth of Prometheus, to the character of Prometheus. The whole setting of this world is that we had this this group of ambitious scholars and scientists who stole power from the gods against the warnings of one of their own and were punished for it. And that punishment extended beyond just the people, who brought this power. It extended into the entire world. Before we even set foot in the game, this has been set in motion, right? We're just living in this world. But these scholars from Bergenworth, they went down into the tombs and they found this medium. They found the blood of the old ones. What the source of that blood was is kind of ambiguous. I personally think it's Ebritus, right? If you go up into the highest parts of the cathedral ward, up where the choir is, you can find an old one that was left behind by the other old ones. This blood, this power, fundamentally changes humanity. It can prolong somebody's life. It can heal illnesses. It intoxicates people. There's, in the item description for the blood vials, it says that more blood is produced in Yharnam than alcohol because it's more intoxicating for people. But it warps and deforms people. It changes them from human beings. The more blood that somebody uses, sort of the less human they become. And ultimately, it will lead to a person's death. And this blood also kind of opens a doorway for communion between humanity and beings of a higher plane. David Lynch sort of had this same idea about nuclear weapons. In the third season of Twin Peaks, it's basically outright stated that the Trinity atomic test, the first ignition of an atomic weapon in human history, kind of opened a doorway to this other plane of existence, and all of these awful things came through that doorway. And I think that's a very interesting and artistic way of looking at the consequences of developing that bomb. Because it did, in a sense, open a doorway to a different path for humanity. The world that we would have without these weapons is very, very different from the world that we have now. And this blood in Bloodborne is also used as a method of control and class separation. Right? If you are dependent on this scarce resource that one class of people control, then those people, that class of people, by extension, control you. You have to behave in a certain way and do what they tell you because you need this thing that they have, that they administer to you. We have the church and the choir who are in charge of blood ministration. Right? They have this resource that everybody needs. It's like sort of the furthering of class society and the control of one class by another because of this great power that one class has. The possession of nuclear weapons in our world is also a matter of great debate. Who gets to have these things and who doesn't get to have them determine a lot about what your country is going to look like, what sort of laws you have, what sort of conflicts you get into. So in that way, it is pretty similar to this blood, right? It's this thing which furthers this class separation and control. And in Yharnam, the whole of society is reorganized around this blood, right? That these Prometheus characters brought back from the gods. In Bloodborne, it's very interesting because instead of ascending up to like a higher realm of the gods, the scholars descend into these tombs. They go into these ancient ruins and they find this thing that had previously ruined another society, the Tumerians, right? They use this blood as well. The blood moon descended. The old ones appeared. Old ones or great ones? I can never remember. I can't get those straight. The great ones, the old ones, whatever. It's all Lovecraft. The Great Ones descended and just wiped out their society. So it's like in Yharnam, they're not learning the lessons of the past. They are instead looking to use this thing that had previously ruined another society. They have this hubris, right? They can't look ahead into the future. They can't look backwards. They can't learn from any of these things because they are too intoxicated by this power that they have. It's very clear in Bloodborne that this blood is the power of the gods that's given to mortal human beings who are self-destructive in nature. This power brings out the worst qualities in humanity and amplifies them to the point where this chain reaction starts to just run wild in Yharnam. This is kind of a really big theme in a lot of Fromsoftware's games. This idea of like, stay in your lane, you know, and not in like an authoritarian way, but like to all of humanity. Hey, stay in your lane. There are things that you shouldn't be messing with. Natural cycles, the logic of the universe, these sort of base laws and properties. And when anybody decides to try and tamper with these fundamental things or things that are beyond their grasp, when they have this pride and ambition to them, it will bring them high and then bring them low. And they will bring a whole lot of people low with them. In Dark Souls, right, this is the kindling of the first flame, the extension of the Age of Fire beyond when the fire should have faded. In Bloodborne, it's the use of this blood, even though people understand that it has these negative side effects. And that's a very interesting idea and another sort of classic literary theme that you see in these games. And I think that's just why some of these stories stick with me more than the stories in other games. You know, it's not full of cutscenes and characters and exposition, but they, in these games, they suggest things. They hint at things. They let you decide if you want to spend time thinking about those or if you just want to ignore it and get on with doing what you're doing. But they're chock full of these allusions and references, literary themes and ideas, and they play with them in some very interesting ways. So if you're paying attention and if you're interested in what these games have to say and the ideas that they are bringing up and just sort of thrown out there for you to think about, you know, it's something that you can do, and that's what I appreciate about these. So that's Prometheus and Bloodborne and Oppenheimer. Again, definitely go see Oppenheimer. Excellent movie. Go see it in IMAX if you can. It's very loud. The sound design is incredible. The editing is phenomenal. The music is amazing. The performances are great. This is one that I'm going to be thinking about for quite a long time.